Good morning, everybody. My name is Jutta Bindewald. I'm working in the Technology and Innovation Platform team at SAP. And I want to tell you a bit about our experience with open source at SAP. So when you're trying to introduce open source at a company, at a department, you will face several stages of acceptance. The first stage is not acceptance, but in most cases complete denial. From management and from development. People tell you, oh, never ever I will use open source. It's not made by us, it's too many legal risks, it's too much bureaucracy, we will not use it. But with time and with experience, people try to play around a little bit with open source. Oh, I use it only a little bit. I try to put it in my product and people see, hey, it works, and it's cool stuff in the open source communities, and stuff I can use for my product. So they start really using it. But when they use it, they find out, sometimes there are bugs inside, which is pretty normal, or there are missing features, and people try to contribute to that open source. And at that point in time, if they're really interested, they want to be a committer, and everything is done. So they accept the open source. And when we did the same thing at SAP, it was completely the same sequence of events. So when you talk to people at SAP about open source in the beginning, some years ago, they said, okay, with open source we cannot create tailored software. That will not work. We know what our customer needs, and the open source stuff will never do that for the customer. Only we can do. We talk to our customers. We know what they want. A real problem in case of errors, I cannot react quickly. I have SLA, service levels agreements to follow. And when I use the open source, I have to convince a committer or something like that, or to fork the open source. And I cannot do that in time to give my customer a proper solution in time. A homemade problem, it takes too long till I get an approval for open source. We come to that later, to the approval process. Open source is perfect, but will never replace my project, my coding, because it's handmade, it's tailored. This will not work with open source. More a management perspective of that, dealing with open source will kill you when it comes to the licenses. You have to check everything, and this will not work for us. A big danger, we will lose our IP if we use open source. We have no control about that. A big risk. And something which is more on the personal side, but is really a big problem even for developers who develop for a longer time in a closed system. Everyone can read and review my code. And it seems a bit ridiculous, but it isn't. Think about people who are working on a project for, let's say, 5 to 10 years. They're the absolute experts. They're fulfilling all their requirements, and they're doing really an excellent job. And now they go to open source. And there are other experts around. And they criticize their coding, or they have proposals how to improve it. And for some of the guys, it's really hard to understand. And it needs some time to get used to it. So this is really some of a big hurdle you have to overcome. And one of the biggest arguments, there's no business model for open source. If you use open source in a closed environment as SAP was in the past, you will not make money with that. This will not work. So conclusion was for most of the people, okay, open source is very, very good. I like it very much. But not for my business case. This will not work. And we came to a turning point when we started developing in the Java environment. I think you might know that SAP grew up with an own development language, ABAP. And, okay, you can say a lot about ABAP and things, but it really worked wonderful for our needs. And I have to confess, I really liked developing in ABAP. But there were no standards, it was completely proprietary, and so the company came to the conclusion that we have to adhere more to standards, and that's why we want to make more in the Java environment. Okay, and when we're in the Java environment, we have to find an IDE to work with. And for ABAP, we did everything on our own. Every development environment, every transportation process, everything. So when we wanted to work with Java, we didn't have enough skilled people to build an IDE on our own in a reasonable amount of time. So we went to the market and looked around what is available for us, and so we started cooperating with Borland and JBuilder. But it showed up that JBuilder didn't have the technical APIs we wanted to have. They had a license model that did not fit our needs, and so we quit the cooperation. And I think from 2002 on, we started development on the Eclipse open source platform, and from 2004 on, we were one of the founding members of the Eclipse Foundation, and from that point in time, we are a strategic member of the Eclipse Foundation. But you see, that's not a complete turning point. The complete turning point came when we started to contribute to the Eclipse Foundation. And SAP started contributing to the WTP project, and we built Java EE tools on top of the WTP project. So we did our first contributions to the open source community. I think 2009 it was, or 7 or 9, we also contributed to the data platform, DTP, tooling platform project, and for the first time we donated a complete project to the open source community, which was the memory analyzer. It was the first time we did not only follow others, but donated a project where the project lead, and then things worked. But at that point in time, we found out, okay, people like open source, people work in open source, but we have to have rules for that. Rules to say to developers, okay, you can use this project, you can't use that project. You can use everything, for example, that has an EPL license, but you cannot use projects that have, for example, a GNU license or something, GPL license. This will not work for you. You have to have a certain set of rules that people has to stick on, adhere to. But I think there are a lot of developers here in this room, and I think you know from personal experience that you want to develop tools, you want to develop cool stuff, and you do not want to take care for licenses and all that stuff, or IP infringements. That's not what people want to do. So even if they have in mind they should not use some kind of products like GPL license, you as a company have to make sure that they do not do it accidentally. So you have to define processes that make sure that people adhere to the set of rules you give them. And these processes, okay, it sounds very German and very bureaucratic, but you have to have this. At least that's our experience. SAP promises the customer to be standards compliant in a way that we take care for security checks, for IP licenses and all that stuff. And the customer relies on that. And the customer doesn't care whether the sources we use or they got shipped will be from SAP handmade or if they are from open source. So you have to make sure as a company that both the open source and your sources made by your developers are standards compliant. That's important. Okay, SAP is an open source consumer. When we started with open source, we were first allowed to use open source, which is not so easy to understand because in my opinion it's much more dangerous to use open source than to contribute to open source. If you're contributing, you can make sure what you give out to the open source community if there are the correct licenses, if there's no IP you want to keep for your company and all that stuff. If you're using open source, you get a bunch of binaries, and you have to pray that there's nothing inside like GPL or IP infringements or that. So if you do not want to pray, you have to do the checks on your own if you use the open source. And when it comes to IP and license checks, SAP uses the Black Duck tool to make sure that in the binaries we ship there will be no IP infringements or nasty licenses like GPL. We also check the open source for security vulnerabilities that should not be in, and for export control and everything. All these checks are done. And we adhere to the product standards for our software and for the open source software. And as an exception, we have to say when we build in things from the Eclipse Foundation, we are a bit less careful concerning the IP checks and the license checks, because we know that at Eclipse side, these checks will be done for us. They are already conducted, and we can rely that there is no infringement or nasty license inside the binaries we get to ship to our customers. And at the moment, it's a rough estimate, but I think we're using more than 1,100 open source components in our products. SAP as a committer or contributor, as I said, when we started with the open source stuff, we were allowed to use it, but not to contribute or to be a committer in an open source project. But strangely enough, when some years ago you wanted to have an open source project for usage in your product, you have to fill out a formula saying, why do you want it? Why is it needed? Why can't you do it on your own? And what will you do in case of errors? Do you really state that in case of errors you will help to solve this, you will solve the errors, and if you say no, you didn't get the approval. But you say no, you say yes, I will do it, you got the approval. But think about, we are only allowed to use the open software, not to contribute or to commit anything. So it doesn't really fit together, so we had to improve that. SAP is committed and contributed to open source. Only an example. I think at Eclipse side we have more than 50 committers in different projects. Eclipse projects, we have project leads or co-project leads are the Scully, some kind of project portal, the Git, memory analyzer, and Gemini. Okay, now I have to confess I'm a bit proud because the Git project itself was honored the second time by the Eclipse Foundation this year as being the most open project. I think that's really a success for the guys. We're not only engaged in the Eclipse Foundation, but we're also engaged in Apache. We have projects at GitHub and at SourceForge. So you see, there's a lot of variety where SAP tries to contribute and to commit project. Okay, now we were in a status that we had committers in the projects, we had contributions to projects, and we had processes in place. But if we looked a bit closer at these, especially at the processes, we have seen that there's a lot of place for improvement. And again, there was a turning point when we acquired a company which used really a lot of open source. And this was a small company. They had a lot of open source components. And we were thinking, my God, how did they do that? If they had our processes, they would have never shipped their content to any customer. So why can they do that so fast, giving approval to usage of open source components, and we can't? Are they too careless, or are we too cautious? And I think it's somewhere in the middle where you find the truth. But we worked on our processes for approval, and nowadays the approval processes are less than 30 days, which is at least acceptable. I think when we started it was more than 3 months to get an approval. And think about you're a developer and you develop your stuff and you say, hey, I want to use this open source component, and a lawyer tells you, okay, we will check for this and come back in 3 months or later. This will not work. So it's less than 30 days, and contribution approval process is also less than 30 days. And we already have a list of pre-approved projects which do not need an approval again, but can be used without involving the lawyers. Okay, but even if we have all these processes in place and the rules developers had to adhere to, we should always remember that there is some kind of dark side of open source when it comes to licenses or IP infringements. And especially the licenses, I think developers and the lawyers should take care of. As a developer, when you try to use a project, you see under which license it comes, and if there's some viral license like GPL, you shouldn't use it. You should even not try to get an approval for that. Because I think that the GPL is a viral license, and every derivative work done with such a project leads to the fact that the project itself must be open source under GPL. So if you use GPL in your software stack, all the software stack might get affected by that and must be open source under GPL, which is not acceptable, I think. And one of the points, at least for a company like SAP who has service level agreements with the customers, some dark point is the maintenance question. That was what Ralph mentioned and what Sylvia mentioned. We have obligations to our customers that we have to take care for maintenance for at least 9 years in the Java stack. If Java stack and the ABAP suite come together, it's an obligation to maintain the software for at least 15 years. And when it comes to Airbus and other companies, it's about 80 years, I think. So how will that work with open source? When you look at the Eclipse side, a project has a life cycle of more or less 9 months. You have the release, Service Pack 1, Service Pack 2, and that's it. Okay, but what do you do if your customer sticks to an older release and you have to do maintenance for that? And so the question is, how do you fix bugs in older releases and older open source versions? What you can do, you can fork the source code. You get the open source, you fork it, and you deliver a handmade binary to the customer. You have to take care for the build, for the signing, for all that stuff. You can do it, but it will be very costly, and you have to, if the customer sticks longer to that release, you have to do it again and again. You can try to convince the committers of this project to do the bug fixes. But our experience is that they really do not like, they do not see it as their obligation to do that. They want to build in new software, and that's what they like, and they say, okay, we have a certain release train, we have a certain life cycle, and what's above that, we are no longer interested. And that's okay. It started from that point, and that's okay. You can, as a company, as SAP, you can ask your customer to update to a newer release. That's easy said, but not made. Because, as an example, we have a Java server which uses JE 1.3, and when you now tell the customer, okay, use a newer Eclipse version like Juno or something like that, then for JE development he will go to WTP, and WTP, for example, requires Java 1.4. So this will clash, it will not work together. So at that point in time you have a real problem. And at least when it comes to Eclipse projects, I think we have a solution, or we are working on a solution for that. And so our proposal would be that you join the LTS working group. LTS is a long-term support program built at Eclipse site, and I think in 2009, the discussion started at Eclipse site, and SAP was one of the members who triggered, in person of Carsten Schmidt, this.
You were the company.
We were the company who triggered the discussion. Okay, thanks. And I think in 2010, the LTS working group was founded at the Eclipse Foundation. And what is the LTS working group? It's a working group that offers you different stages of participation level. You can be a premium member, you can be a participating member, or you can be a steering member. As the words say, the steering member, you have much influence, you can influence the direction we go to, you have access to the source code, to the older source code. We are only talking about older releases, not about the new development. You have access to the old source code, and you can use the build infrastructure present at SAP, at Eclipse. When you are a premium member, you have access to the source code, and you can do the builds on your own. You can do bug fixes. And as participating member, you can have access to the binaries containing the fixes. As I said, we try to establish a common build infrastructure at Eclipse built on Maven, Tycho, and Git repositories. Means for sure that projects using Buckminster and other build technologies should go to the common build infrastructure and to Maven and that stuff. What the advantage is that you, as a company, do not longer have to take care for the bug fixing in older releases. You can use a comfortable build infrastructure, and you can provide and can elect your own maintenance committers or maintenance providers. And I think this will be very helpful for companies with maintenance obligations that will be valid for a very long time, so 9 years or 15 years or 80 years. So if you're interested to learn more about the LTS, there will be links to documentation within the slides in the appendix, or please contact me and I will we can have a discussion on that, and I can bring you in contact with the CBI people and all that stuff. Okay, that's all from my side. Thank you.